Somewhere. Hey, sir. How you doing, sir?
Yeah, good. How about you?
Hey, sir. How are you?
Good afternoon. Everybody in? Any more? Well, good afternoon. This is a little more well attended than anticipated, but that's always a good thing. My name is James Covington. I am the Public Affairs Officer for Homeland Security Investigations, Washington, D.C., which includes the HSI Norfolk Field Office here. Due to a very last-minute continuance, we will not be talking about the Pierre de Romeo Smith case today. It'll be the labor trafficking case only because the sentencing hasn't happened. It's ongoing litigation at this time. That said, I'd like to introduce you to ASAC Jim Stitzel. He is the Assistant Special Agent in charge of Homeland Security Investigations, Norfolk.
Thanks, James.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. As James mentioned, I'm Jim Stitzel, the Assistant Special Agent in charge for Homeland Security Investigations here in Norfolk. On behalf of HSI Norfolk, the Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force, U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Jess Aber, Virginia Attorney General Jason Miyares, our federal, state, and local law enforcement, as well as victim service partners, I would like to welcome you all to the Norfolk Federal Building. We apologize for the heat. First off, I'd like to thank the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Virginia Attorney General's Office, and our partner law enforcement and victim service agencies for their tireless efforts and invaluable cooperation in protecting the residents of our Virginia communities. The reason we have invited you all here today is to announce the culmination of a groundbreaking investigation that resulted in the first of its kind labor trafficking sentence. Prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office have secured the first ever labor trafficking convictions in the history of the Eastern District of Virginia. This case was investigated by HSI Norfolk and the Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force in cooperation with federal, state, and local law enforcement partners that you see represented in this room here. In this case, against the proprietors of Magnolia Cleaning Services, the subjects conducted a labor trafficking enterprise where children were forced to work long hours in terrible conditions. These criminals operated a family-based labor trafficking enterprise where they smuggled their workforce into the United States from El Salvador. They coordinated and funded the smuggling of Salvadorian nationals into the U.S. for the purpose of employment at Magnolia Cleaning Services. The victims were further told their smuggling fee was a debt owed to the business. Upon their rescue, one teenage victim told investigators that for a 2-year period from the ages of 14 to 16 years old, they were first forced to work 11-hour overnight shifts before attending their high school classes. Throughout the prosecution of this case, our victim service partners who are here today help stabilize and assist the victims. As a result of our investigation, our partners at the U.S. Attorney's Office secured guilty pleas in the first ever labor trafficking institution for the victims and a $3.9 million forfeiture order pursuant to plea agreements. I want to highlight the vital role played by our victim service partners throughout these investigations. They provided stabilization, housing, medical and mental health assistance to these most vulnerable of victims. Without their partnership, this prosecution would not have been possible, and these traffickers would remain operating in our communities. Before I bring up the U.S. Attorney, on behalf of HSI Norfolk, I would like to again extend the most heartfelt thanks to our partners for their tireless efforts in this investigation, and also to the Virginia Attorney General's Office for their continued partnership with the Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force. Thank you. U.S. Attorney.
Good afternoon. I want to start by thanking all of our partners on the task force here today. It is truly incredible to see such a combination of local, state, and federal law enforcement working together under one mission to end human trafficking in our region and across Hampton Roads. I'm grateful for the opportunity to recognize the incredible work that is done by this task force and speak to the public today who may be watching about the issue of human trafficking. Trafficking takes many forms, but it is consistent in one aspect. Traffickers target the most vulnerable among us, whether it is a minor lured into a prostitution ring by promises of love and affection, or an immigrant told that they must labor arduously under the threat of deportation. The offenders in these trafficking cases rely on a narrative that society does not care about these victims in order to control and abuse them. I'm here today to say that we assembled here do care. No one, regardless of age, regardless of social status, immigration status, or personal history, deserves to have their bodies and efforts exploited for the gain of others. I'm particularly proud of the work, though, that this task force did in our case that we're talking about here today against the owners and managers of the Magnolia Cleaning Services, Anna Patricia Aragon Landaverde, Jeffrey Dean Vaughn, and George William Evans. These individuals, as you heard, harbored, transported, and illegally employed approximately 100 illegal immigrants, including at least one minor, luring them with false promises and forcing them to work back-breaking hours in an unair-conditioned warehouse under the threats of violence and deportation. These victims were made to live in the same warehouse, where they often worked more than 12-hour shifts, deprived of basic housing needs, like a kitchen or shower facilities. And in one example of the cruelty of these crimes, a mother employed and living in the warehouse was prevented even from caring for her infant child and had to tie a bottle for that infant to a stroller. These business owners enrich themselves through this brutal enterprise using fraudulent identification documents and money laundering to falsify their wage records and just benefit themselves from the proceeds. These individuals lied, manipulated, and threatened their victims using fear to trap them in inhumane situations. The sentences of 30 months for George William Evans, 51 months for Jeffrey Vaughn, and 57 months for Anna Landaverde were imposed yesterday. The court also ordered Evans and Vaughn to forfeit more than $3.9 million in proceeds and Landaverde to forfeit more than $200,000. What I want to say here is that this sends a clear message that we will not let this kind of exploitation take place in our communities. Our resolve here in the Eastern District of Virginia echoes that of the whole Department of Justice, which last year announced a multi-year strategy to combat all forms of human trafficking, which included more coordinated efforts like this task force, resources, new protocols, and an increased focus on supporting victims of these crimes. So going forward, I do expect to see continued great work coming out of this task force and others like it around the country. I hope the messages we send here today are able to reach the ears of victims still trapped in the grip of human traffickers, and that they can hear us saying, "We are here to help you. You are not alone." Thank you. And let me turn it over to Attorney General Jason Miyares.
Human trafficking can occur anytime, in any community, and almost anywhere. It is a crime that often happens in plain sight, in plain view. And for too often, too many Virginians and Americans think it doesn't happen here, not in my community. Tragically, it does. So I'm so incredibly proud of the work that has happened, and what you've seen in front of you is what happens when both federal, state, and local law enforcement collaborate together to be a voice for the voiceless. As somebody who's a resident of this area, I was both horrified at this case, but also incredibly grateful for the incredible work done by Homeland Security Investigations Norfolk, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and our Hampton Roads Human Trafficking Task Force, which has worked together to help bring these traffickers to justice. I'm so grateful for our partners on the federal level, Jim Stitzel and Jess Aber, who've worked together to help protect Virginians from this insidious crime. It truly takes everyone at all levels, federal, state, and local, to combat and fight back against this type of crime. The reality is we sometimes think that human trafficking are simply the victims of sexual exploitation. And that is the majority, roughly 60% of all that are the victims of human trafficking or indeed being exploited sexually. But 40%, roughly 40% of those that are the victims of human trafficking are the victims of labor trafficking. They're individuals, as you have heard described, that take advantage of the most vulnerable, that they essentially force them under forced labor and deprive them of their very dignity and, I would say, their humanity. It is so critically important that you, our friends in the media, amplify the fact that this is often happening right in front of our very eyes. Close to 3/4 of human trafficking victims have actually interacted, for example, with medical providers, where they come in and they interacted with the general public. And so I know at the state level, this is something that is very passionate by Governor Youngkin. He has signed the legislation, both training for those that work in the hotel industry, which are often at the front lines of this, legislation that requires first-year college students at Virginia's colleges and universities to look for the signs, because everyone can be part of the effort to eradicate human trafficking. The largest criminal enterprise on the globe is narcotics. The second, a $1.5 billion criminal enterprise, is human trafficking. So it is there, it is prevalent, and I'm so proud of the work that we're doing to push back on this. I would also have a message to all those that are small business owners to decide to cross a line and exploit those that are the most vulnerable. We will find you, we will investigate you, we will prosecute you. And for the victims, we want to be a voice for you. Come out of the shadows, work with us to hold those that have exploited you and your fellow citizens accountable. Thank you all. Again, I want to thank the work of our federal partners, our state partners. Those here have each had an incredible part of this day, but I also want to now bring up one of our local partners, Sheriff Montgomery from York County. Thank you all so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sheriff Ron Montgomery with the York Pocosin Sheriff's Office. And last year, as many people, I was concerned to find out that this was happening in our locality, in the upper part of York County, Virginia. It goes to show you that even after 4 decades in law enforcement, I've even learned that you don't know everything that's going on in the community without communicating with the people. And sometimes it just takes the smallest tips. And the only thing that I'm here to say today is when we first got the tip through the task force about what was going on there, and we went out there, our investigators went with them, I don't know that everybody understood the magnitude of it until they actually got into the warehouse and I started getting briefings on it. So I'm here today to thank the other partners with this task force, the federal government, all the state officials, and let people know out there that are thinking about doing this, if you're starting to think about doing these types of enterprises out here, the work of this task force, the prosecutors, the state, Jason Miari's office will result in the same type of results that we've heard the last few days, that you're going to go to jail and you're going to get prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law if you want to undertake these types of enterprises. So thank you everybody for being a part of that, and thank you for getting that out of my county. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
That's all the remarks we have for today set up, I believe. You want to go to questions?
Yeah. Hi, Michelle Anderson from WHRO Public Media. You guys mentioned this is the first labor trafficking conviction. Surely this isn't the first operation that's ever happened or the only one. What are the challenges in investigating this? What makes it so difficult to get these cases to this point?
I think I'll speak to that. I think, you know, the victims have traditionally been difficult for us to get to the point of the prosecution. But I think every agency represented up here, we've dedicated significant resources to a victim-centered approach. So over the years with that approach, I think we're getting more victims, better witnesses, and we're able to prosecute.
And for this specific case, the victims, are they, like, will they be deported, or have they voluntarily chosen to go back to their home country? What happens with the status of their presence in the United States?
Unfortunately, we don't speak to the status of any of the victims.
I wanted to follow up because Sheriff Montgomery alluded to the tip that the task force gave to his office to get involved with this operation. If either of you can elaborate more, how that task force was able to get tipped about this operation, how did that come about to start the wheels on this process?
Like I'm not, without developing trade secrets, I mean, this is common for these kind of tips to come into the task force. You know, and the task force is, it's broken up into different parts. The law enforcement part of it, which was initially received the tip, will then vet that tip and will determine which agency is then first to go with the investigation to determine if it's going to reach to the federal level or what additional resources may be needed for this.
But can you elaborate, was it someone with this operation that had contact with the task force, or how did this all come to light for you?
Yeah, I'm going to rely on our group supervisor here, Homeland Security Investigations, Adriana Meraki. Adriana, you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yes. We received this. Make sure I heard your question. You were asking how we got the tip and kind of what information we received, correct?
Yes.
So it's very common for us to get tips from individuals who themselves are potential victims, as well as family members or friends and associates who encounter these victims. I think that's a real important reason that we say, if you see something, say something. And the reason I'm saying that is because something that looks out of line or out of place may ultimately be an exploitation or human trafficking situation like it was here. So this specific tip came from an associate of one of the potential victims. I will also answer your question, just give a little bit of information. In particular, we can't speak to the immigration status of every single victim because that's private information. However, the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically Homeland Security Investigations, has the T-Visa program as well as continued presence. These are two mechanisms that law enforcement uses to assist with stabilizing a victim in order to help them assist us with a human trafficking investigation. So I will tell you that those two specific mechanisms are ones that we typically use, and some of them were used as part of this investigation.
Can those programs be used to create a path to permanent citizenship?
They absolutely can. So a T visa is a trafficking visa for victims of human trafficking, and that is a pathway to citizenship, and specifically legal permanent residency is the first step. Okay.
Michelle Wolfway, TV 10, what was the age range of the victims? You mentioned at least one minor.
Yes.
So was the youngest and the oldest?
Sure. 14 years old to over 25 years old. Okay.
Maybe speak to the, I know that she had asked it earlier, but if you could speak more to the significance, the first labor trafficking conviction in this district, just the significance of this first one being brought to light here today.
Yeah, well, and I'll clarify those remarks. It's not necessarily the first of its kind. It's the most significant of its kind, with the focus here being obviously the victims, the amount of fraud, the forfeiture involved here, the deplorable conditions that these folks were working in. So I think that's the most significant of its kind with regards to that, not necessarily the first human trafficking prosecution, or labor trafficking, excuse me.
Our understanding is that the task force has been funded through this September. What does this case mean in terms of the funding moving forward for both a local standpoint and HSI, and also for your office, Attorney General Yards?
Well, I mean, I think it shows what happens when it works, and this is exactly the happens of when it works. I think anybody who's been in law enforcement will tell you that there have times in the past where sometimes egos get in the way, where everybody kind of picks their own turf. I think what has been so rewarding about this entire both investigation collaboration that we've had is that nobody's ego has gotten in the way. This is a great example of federal, state, and local partners all with the same eye on the prize, which is we're going to find those that are exploiting the most vulnerable, we're going to hold them accountable, and we're going to prosecute them. And so I think this is a model, actually a nationwide model of what happens when you have federal, state, and local working together. And so we're confident that this is going to continue moving forward.
Sheriff,
Sorry, just one comment on that. In regards to the task force and the grant, Homeland Security Investigations is, we're dedicated to keep this going. We will not let this task force fall apart. We will keep this going. I know we have commitment from everyone here on the stage to keep it going. So if it's funding is the challenge, Homeland Security Investigations will continue with that.
Quick question for Sheriff. I'm wondering, you oversee, not like the smallest county, but a smaller county. If you didn't have the task force, would you be able to handle an investigation like this, or how would this process have looked different for you and your officers?
Well, I would say based on the magnitude of what this developed into, that being a part of a task force like this was paramount to the success of this investigation. I'm not saying that we may not have known about it, but being able to bring it to the fruition that we're hearing about today and successfully prosecuting these people, particularly in the federal system, was a big bonus.
This is an example, too, of course, of labor trafficking here at Hampton Roads, and we've talked with some of you, before, especially other partners with Samaritan House, about why human trafficking takes place in Hampton Roads. We've said because of the interstate system, the waterways access. Could you elaborate just, how human trafficking is able to take place here at Hampton Roads, and what factors contribute to it?
Well, I would say obviously we're a transient community, we're a large metropolitan area, and one of the largest economic drivers of this region is tourism. And you take all of those together, and tragically, listen, the vast majority of small business owners are trying to do the right thing under some tough economic conditions. But then you have the bad actors. The bad actors decide that they view labor as something to exploit, and that they try to basically cut corners and break the law. And so that's tragically because of all of those factors: large metropolitan area, large transient area, large tourist area. You're going to have that aspect as well, in both sex and labor trafficking. I don't know if you all wanted to elaborate.
I'll just add that, key areas for labor trafficking are agriculture, aquaculture, and tourism, and we have all three of those here at Hampton Roads.
You guys mentioned, if you see something, say something. It seems like people are fairly familiar with signs of sex trafficking. If you're a consumer, what should you be looking for if you're patronizing a business? Like, what should tip you off that something isn't right? Are there any signs of, like, on the consumer side that people can see?
I think something key is, it's a crime hidden in plain sight, right? So if something doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right, we have a lot of resources available. I think there's some information out front there about numbers to call, websites to go to. You can obviously get in touch with someone to report a tip, but also there's red flag indicators and things that the general public can be aware of. And this is, for us, this is really important. Awareness is key for us. Letting folks know this is a crime hidden in plain sight. And anything that we can do to make those more aware in the public, we're all for it.
With instances like these, do you think you have, as news media, we've talked about the shortages of law enforcement and police officers in the field as of recent years. Moving forward, you talked about the importance of having a grant and continuing that grant process. Do you feel like you're able to do that with the numbers that you have in law enforcement? Are you looking to expand this kind of operation, or just continue at its current pace?
Well, as you know, the governor and I launched Operation Bold Blue Line earlier this year, which is the idea was to recruit law enforcement from around the country to come to Virginia. I am a passionate believer that community policing work because it builds trust in the community. You have some of our largest metropolitan areas in the state that have a 40% vacancy rate in their law enforcement. And my other hope is that if anybody who's a young man or woman that wants a job that matters, this is a job that matters. The people in this room do not wake up in the morning and wonder whether their job matters. They know that it does. And so it's an incredible profession. There's a certain level of nobility of the fact that you're the good guy. You're the one rushing in and protecting the most vulnerable. And so it is something that we're passionate about. That is something that has been alarming for both myself and the governor. I think at all levels of law enforcement, the number of vacancy rates makes it harder for these men and women to do their job. And so we're encouraging that. Anybody from another state, that Virginia is obviously a pretty incredible place to live and work, come to Virginia and be part of this extraordinary group and the work they do every day, protecting those that are the most vulnerable and the most that are exploited. So we're getting a large amount of money, at least at the state level, for both pay increases and making sure that our law enforcement personnel are properly compensated. That's part of it. Part of it is just appreciation. And I love to say, I tell my daughters that gratitude's the most underrated of human traits. We have such gratitude for those that are at the front lines every day. We want the word to get out, and also for young people, your local law enforcement community is hiring. If you've ever had a dream of being one of the good guys, here's your chance. Sign up, state or local, and if you're really, really exceptional, federal as well. I know our federal partners are always looking as well, but be part of the law enforcement community, be part of something exceptional and great.
And I'll just add one thing there. As Sheriff Montgomery said, there's no doubt without this task force, in this age of constrained resources, we have to be force multipliers of each other in law enforcement. But also I'll add in is the victim assistance specialists. Those services that have been available for victims, these organizations, they're equally as important, if not more important, because there's a victim-centered approach amongst every agency represented up here, and that's our key, is to protect the victims.
I have a question about, obviously this is a federal prosecution, and I know in recent years there's been, changes to federal laws to make it, to make the laws reflect trafficking situations. Attorney General, I'm wondering about Virginia state laws. Like, where are we with, I think particularly the first one that I think of is like, definitions of prostitution, for example, when we're dealing with sex trafficking victims. Where are we with sort of making sure our state code sort of takes into consideration the nuances of trafficking?
Well, I think you've seen a revolution in the General Assembly. I think it's a bipartisan issue. Most people have recognized that this is something that both happens in plain sight and particularly for victims. And so I know when I was in the General Assembly, I helped carry the legislation that allowed the victims to expunge themselves, to expunge their records. So in many ways, as you know, that can impact when they're for their employment. So I think the most encouraging thing I've seen is very much a trauma-informed, victim-centric approach to how we begin the process of healing. And that healing can come in many forms, and one of which is empowering the victim to be willing to testify against those that have taken advantage of them. It is a really, really brave thing to ask somebody to relive the single worst moments of their life on a witness stand. That's not easy. And so, as the special agent noted, having victim-centric approach and victim services, that is one part of the equation. I know that's something the governor's put in his budget. We've really created our own victim witness program we're going to run through the state police that we've never had before. And not just on this, but on others, we would hear from victims that they didn't feel safe to testify, and it's going to be pretty similarly modeled on what the federal program is. But I think you've seen a real revolution, I think, in the General Assembly to realize just how exploitive, how prevalent this is, and enhancing those penalties. But it goes back to a lot of what has been said already previously. See something, say something. Whether it's a tip, a confidential informant, none of this work would happen if it wasn't for a brave individual willing to pick up the phone and say something to the right person. So when you're looking at signs, if you're at a hotel, when we did training for clerks, it's the signs to look for if somebody's being somebody's checking into a hotel with somebody that looks like they're a minor, somebody that is hesitant to tell you where they're from, where their residence. They avert any and all communication with strangers. There's certain signs you can look for as well. But I really am encouraged by the fact that this has become a bipartisan issue in the General Assembly, in which people are recognizing this is both prevalent, it's happening in too many communities, and let's give law enforcement the tools they need. And when you give law enforcement the tools they need to succeed, this is what you have. So I'm hopeful for the future. There's been a variety of recommendations out of the Human Trafficking Task Force, which our office is part of with the governor, that we're going to see in January. You know, the General Assembly only meets 60 days a year, so we'll be back in January. But we have some additional recommendations. This is something I know that's very personal for the governor and the First Lady. They've been involved in this even before, when they were private citizens on this issue, and they want to raise the awareness, and this is a passion project for them.
I want to ask, we've seen certain marketing and communications toward other priorities like fentanyl, the One Pill Can Kill campaign. What more do you think could be done at the local or state level in terms of marketing and communications for sex trafficking and human trafficking?
Well, I think the One Pill Can Kill, that was a great partnership with our federal partners that we launched. Total drug overdose in 1992 in the United States was roughly 5,000. Last year was 108,000, and it is taking too many innocent Virginians every day. You know, a lot of this is our law enforcement partners talking about the fact, again, when I said in my opening remarks, too many of those in communities think this isn't happening here, and so candidly, you're part of the fight. Sometimes it gets hard to have some of our friends, our partners in the media, be open to talk about this and highlight this issue. And the more that you do, and the more you highlight the work they do, the more the public is aware that you could be you could be that scarlet thread that unravels an entire human trafficking ring, just if you see something and you say something to the right person. And so every private citizen, one of the greatest ways you could show that you love your neighbor is if you think they are being exploited, say something. Don't just look down on your phone and think that's not my problem. It's all of our problem to raise that awareness, to make authorities aware, and sometimes it takes just that one phone call, that one tip, to have the results we have today. And I know a lot of our other investigations, that's oftentimes how they start.
I wanted to ask and follow up, because I know that you know, some of the victims here in this case, as you mentioned, are teen children here, and just I wonder how you all feel just being the investigators in this case, you know, with these group of people that are involved with this from the victim standpoint. And I know Sheriff Montgomery had a message to those who may be out there that are instigating cases similar to this. Do either of you have anything else you'd like to say to those who may be doing this type of activity here in Hampton Roads?
I mean, I have 3 daughters, all school age. Oldest is 2 teenagers, 1 minor. And so I think once you see this level of exploitation, there is no doubt that there is evil in the world. I could think of no crime more heinous than someone that would use and exploit the vulnerability of a child for ill-gotten gains, whether it's for sex or for labor. There is a reason why I think anyone in law enforcement will tell you that there is a special level of revulsion towards those that exploit our minor children. And there's also a special level of satisfaction when you hold those accountable that have done so. And so it is also, candidly, I would think, speaking on behalf of law enforcement, it's also one of the hardest parts of the job. When you see those that are so young and so innocent with such incredible potential being exploited by such callous, cruel human beings. And it also gives you a certain level of satisfaction when you see this level of accountability and justice. Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attendance today. If you need anything, follow up. I think everybody here has my email. Feel free to email me, and if you need something further work on, I'm happy to do that. Again,
Thank you all very much.
Yeah. Can I keep this on just for notes? I'll just use what